Thanks for being here. My name is Tuju Eche. I'm an assistant risk manager at Turner& Townsend, and we're joined today by some of our experts from Baily, Garner. This is a retrofit information support and expertise. That's a RISE event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy, Security, and Net Zero, and it's developed by Turner & Townsend. Thank you again for joining, and I'll be handing over to our experts from Baily, Garner to start today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, welcome everyone to this afternoon's masterclass covering the retrofit coordinator role in pre and post contract delivery. This is what we've got in store today. So we're kicking off with what the role of the retrofit coordinator is. I will keep this section fairly brief as the topic area, I think, was covered in a session a couple of weeks ago. And there's also plenty of content online about what the role of the retrofit coordinator is. But I think it's always important, even if it is as a useful reminder and scene setting, about what the role of the coordinator actually is. That will lead us on to the PAS process. And again, a very useful reminder of what the PAS process is, as it isn't actually such a dark art as some people might like you to believe, and follows a very logical format, which is always nice. I'll then go on to what is outside of the role and the scope of the retrofit coordinator, and obviously what is inside their scope, because there is many other roles in a retrofit project, and that's even outside of the PAS standard. And all those individuals need to be pulling in the same direction to create a successful project. And of course, the retrofit coordinator is one of those individuals. What we'll then do is lead on to the key roles of the coordinator, and also some of sort of the best practice ideas and concepts for each stage of a retrofit project. The slides, again, somewhat helpfully follow a start to finish approach to a retrofit project. And then we'll also, as I said, come on to some best practice ideas. A little bit about ourselves. So my name's Ben Lambun-Ralph. I am an associate partner at Baily Garner, and I've been with the organisation for 6 years. I've got a background in building surveying. When I initially joined Baily Garner, I was actually in our new build team, so really looking at new build schemes. And I learned a lot from our project managers in the way in which projects should be approached. And I then moved to our building surveyor team. I'm a chartered building surveyor. I'm qualified in the PAS roles and really been involved since the demonstrator phase. And I currently lead our retrofit team out of our London office, so very much focusing on all of our operational delivery around London and the South. And I'll just let my colleague Matthew introduce himself.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, good afternoon all. I'm Matthew Alcock. I'm a technical retrofit lead at Baily Garner. Similar experience to Ben. I also take a keen interest in environmental issues and do day-to-day retrofit work, having done previously some clerk of works quality control inspections and worked with building control as well. Pass back to Ben.
Thank you, Matt. And yes, a little bit about Baily Garner. So we've got 250 members of staff across our 3 offices. So that's London, Birmingham and Manchester. So that creates national coverage for our retrofit projects and lots of things to learn. We've been doing retrofit, although it wasn't as popular then, with some notable schemes very early on, as early as 2008, one of which called Sterndale Road, which won various awards in 2008 and 2012. But our sort of core understanding and experience and expertise around PAS and retrofit really took off as the SHDF demonstrator phase was introduced. And as the funding grew through wave 1, 2, 2.2 and into wave 3, we like to think our experience, our capacity and expertise similarly grew. Company has been again around since 1976 with sort of building surveying at its core. And we like to treat our retrofit projects as a construction project. And that's how we view them. And that's how we think they should be treated, as a construction project, and then supplemented by the PAS standard. And that often leads to successful delivery. And we've got project managers, quantity surveyors, architects. So lots and lots of expertise within our building, which is always helpful when you come across challenges. So I'm going to come on to what the role of the retrofit coordinator is, as again, a bit of a reminder. And I think it's almost important first just to understand what PAS 2035 is. So PAS 2035 is a standard that governs how retrofits are undertaken for domestic buildings. So how they should be assessed, designed and delivered. And then the retrofit coordinator plays a central role in managing that and overseeing that process. So almost the glue between all of the different stages and all of the different individuals and roles. And they are probably, apart from occupants and the client, one of the only people that is involved from start to finish. So it's a really important role in retrofit. If everyone is looking for some more information in relation to exact roles and responsibilities, the Retrofit Academy have some quite useful documents which almost list out what those individuals will be doing, and it's almost like a check sheet. So if you Google Retrofit Academy roles, it will come up. But the coordinator, from a sort of PAS perspective, ensures that all stages, assessment, design, installation, and evaluation, are properly completed and documented. So that means that that individual actually has to have a lot of knowledge and experience in all of the other roles. They are, because they're not focused on a particular aspect, they've got that holistic view. And not to put down a retrofit assessor as an example, but their role is, in the whole grand scheme of it, quite isolated. So they need to go to the property, assess the property, look at its condition, again, create a really comprehensive survey of that property, but then they're on to the next property and the next property after that. The coordinator bridges the gap between all of those different things. So they need to actually understand what the roles are of those individuals who play pivotal roles in the project itself. They obviously ensure that the project is compliant to PAS 2035, and again, oversee those other roles I referenced earlier. But there's also other compliance requirements outside of PAS that they need to consider, such as building regulations, planning, and they need to stay abreast of changes in relation to that. An example of that is the somewhat recent introduction of the Building Safety Act, which again will affect any construction or retrofit project. They will then, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail in due course, but take information from the assessment stage, come up with the proposals for the property. And that actually is a lot of responsibility, and you need to get it right, because you're not only working out what happens for the property now through the IOE, but also what happens in the future through the medium-term plan. So again, really important that you get it right, and the coordinator has the experience to be able to do that. They'll also be fundamental in liaising between the various project stakeholders, and I like to almost see them as a project manager for the PAS process. And of course, finally leading on to handover, lodgement, and the monitoring and evaluation process, which again, I'll go on in a bit more detail in due course. So just some of the changes in relation to the requirements of the retrofit coordinator. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there was a new standard or new version of the PAS standard that was released in 2023, and that came into force this year. And that created various changes to many different components of the standard. So it removed the risk pathway procedure, altered some qualification requirements, created the requirements around airtightness strategies. And again, as a bit of pointer in terms of reference, the BSI group completed a really useful presentation covering all of the stage changes. So again, if you sort of search PAS 2035, 2023 changes, BSI, and go on their YouTube, it's definitely a worthwhile watch. One of the, I guess, the most fundamental and probably talked about changes in relation to the RC role was in relation to their requirements of site inspections and visits. So what there was previously was the RC would be involved through the start of the project, and then the installation stage would be passed to the installer and governed by 2030. It's still governed by 2030, but there's more of requirements around the coordinator. But previously, there was a lot of instances where the coordinator would almost be approaching projects at a desk-based approach, which, from my personal view, I think that's bonkers, to be honest. How can you, as a coordinator, be involved in all the stages of the project, but then when it gets to one of the most critical stages, which is the installation stage, and that often have no key role in it? And that's with the slides on the screen now. We've obviously got our friend looking very pensively into his screen. We can't do that anymore. We need to be on site and looking at the installation. And we've seen in the industry that there has been instances of quality issues, and it makes sense as a change to me. I think one of the challenges that we're going to have is in relation to the number of coordinators and the scale of the projects that we've got at the moment. It's as a principle, an easy idea. Okay, we've got quality issues. We're going to increase the requirements of the RC, but we've got a small pool of RCs and we've got a big challenge ahead of us. So the way in which that is approached needs to be given careful consideration. It is important also to reference that the standard does allow for other professionals to undertake that inspection, sort of on behalf of the retrofit coordinator, provided that they have the competence and the accreditations to be to do that. And that really aligns with the requirements of the retrofit designer. So if they are a member of MCIB, RICS, architect, they could undertake that role. So it could mean that a coordinator is overseeing a project as a whole and then relying on other individuals to undertake quality inspections. They obviously can't palm it off, so to speak, but they can work collaboratively with other people to ensure that quality is ingrained through the installation. Similarly, I would always say when you're liaising with your installers, make sure that your time on site is worthwhile. You know, we've had instances where individuals will go to site because we go to site every week. It's what we do, but actually there's nothing to see on site. There's been no progress since last week. And that time as a coordinator, and your time's precious, you could be doing other useful things. And again, similarly, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of the PAS process, because again, there is a tendency to think it is a little bit confusing, but actually it's not such a dark art, as I said earlier. So we've got a somewhat crazy diagram on the slide at the moment. There is a crazier diagram to come, so strap yourself in. But the PAS process itself actually follows a very logical flow, which is always very helpful. And that follows a process of a preliminary stage. So that's aligned to almost a project setup. So we are liaising with the client and working out our intended outcomes, establishing the objectives for the project, really getting it set up. And that will then lead on to the dwelling assessment and the significance assessment. So again, we're really fully understanding what the property is, what its constraints are, what the potential improvements are. That then leads to the IOE and MTP stage, where we do that modelling. We're putting together a package of works that will be the best for that property, most suitable. That then leads to the actual detailed design. So we're designing those measures. And then, as we can now see, that then flows into PAS 2030, which is, again, governing the installation through the pre-installation building inspection. So allowing the installer to undertake their own inspection and make sure that it is feasible to install that particular measure. The measure itself will then be installed, followed by any testing, commissioning and handover of that particular measure. And following completion of the installation will then lead on to an evaluation. And if anyone has sort of administered or been involved in construction contracts where there's a defects period, I quite like to view the monitoring and evaluation almost as a defects period for PAS. So you are looking at that and working out, okay, did we achieve our intended outcomes? Are there any problems that are as a result of these retrofit works that need further investigation? And in your sort of mind's eye, if you have that diagram and flowchart on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side will have the various roles, you can see how the coordinator is present throughout that whole journey. And then you may have roles supplementing the coordinator who play pivotal roles in each stage. But again, the coordinator is consistent throughout. I think it's also worthwhile just remembering that we are doing a construction project. We've got roles in PAS, which are on the screen here: advisors, installers, designers, assessors, coordinators. But actually, there's likely to be more people who are involved in this project. So whether that be the client, depending on how many houses and properties they manage, they may have a team of asset managers that after we've completed our installation will then manage and look after routine maintenance, etc. for that work. You may have clerk of works, you may have a quantity surveyor, you may have a project manager. So these again are all roles that will be involved in the project. And I think it's really important for the RC to have an understanding of those roles and where they fit in relation to all of that. So that's what this diagram is kind of trying to illustrate. So this table is taken from our Retrofit at Scale toolkit, which is taking again some of the themes that we've just discussed there. So the idea of the retrofit coordinator and other roles. So retrofit coordinator again plays a pivotal role, and some of their responsibilities are detailed at the bottom, which again we talked about earlier. But then also we've labeled it a retrofit project manager, but that's just almost for the purposes of this table. It could be undertaken by a client project manager, a contract administrator, but it illustrates some of the key activities that will really make retrofit a success. So for example, developing a retrofit scheme and delivery approach. So how are we actually going to, as a construction project, manage this work? Maybe develop a project execution plan, look at the construction contract between the client and the installer, consider overall risk. So, risks that will affect the project itself, look at project financials, all of those sorts of things. If you read PAS, isn't a requirement of the retrofit coordinator, but in our eyes, again, needs to be done to make a successful project. And in some instances, it may be suitable for a particular consultant or individual to undertake both of those roles. So they are undertaking both a coordinator type function as well as a project management type function. And we've often found that that sort of blended approach between both of those roles can really make a project a success, rather than simply just following the processes in PAS, because that can lead to inefficiencies, particularly when at scale. So I did promise a slightly crazy diagram, and I've clearly delivered. But the idea behind this, which is again taken from our Retrofit toolkit, is trying to promote the idea of a project management-based approach to retrofit. And when I say the REBA plan of work, to some people, the REBA plan of work rings a bell. You've done it, you've used it in your everyday. To other people, it might not mean anything, but don't worry, I'll explain. So again, when we were concocting this diagram, and whoever the designer was had clearly been watching too much Wheel of Fortune, it tries to overlay the PAS standard and the work stages that we looked at earlier, that sequential approach, with the RIBA plan of work. And for those that aren't familiar with the RIBA plan of work, it is a document that's produced by the Royal Institute of British Architects that organises the process of briefing, designing, constructing and operating projects in relation to construction projects. And that's divided into 8 stages. And within those stages, there's core tasks, information exchanges required at each stage. And if you are from a sort of project management background, it's often used almost on a daily basis when you are delivering a construction project, because it does create a really nice framework for delivery of that project. And almost how we see it is that framework should be in every project, and then that's supplemented by the PAS standard. They have, RIBA have completed different overlays, so used their sort of standard RIBA plan of work and then made them specific for things like passive house, MMC, so modern methods of construction type projects, but never for retrofit. And again, that's what we're trying to do here, is create that alignment. And again, if you do want to have a look into that, again, if you type RIBA plan of work, it'll be the first thing to come up. Again, if you really look into it, you could probably argue maybe a different stage of the PAS process could fit into a different box better, but that's all semantics. And really, it's the idea of this and the idea of the toolkit is it allows the project to be treated as a proper project and will help the RC in delivering that project. And again, if you do want to have a read of that, if you type in Baily Garner retrofit toolkit at scale, it will come up. So the next sections, what I'm going to do is talk about some of the key requirements of the retrofit coordinator. I'm not going to go into every single requirement and into a lot of detail because I would still be going and we'd be ready for dinner. But what I'm going to talk about is sort of the key activities, and the slides are broken down to have the retrofit coordinator's responsibilities and then some of the ideas around best practice. And you won't necessarily find these best practice ideas written in PAS, but again, that's from our experience in how to make these projects a success. And really, as a coordinator, you can add a lot of value to a project by merely even just suggesting one of these ideas. Again, particularly when we're talking about retrofit at scale, because I think if you have an instance where you've got a project that's 10 properties, let's say, as an example, if the processes that sit behind that aren't particularly working as well as they could be, you can, I don't want to say get away with it, but because you're on a smaller scale, you can manage it. Whereas if we now have 100 properties or 1,000 properties, as we will have, those issues will only exacerbate and the project will have massive issues and difficulties. And that's where we are now. We are at the delivery at scale. We've done demonstrator, we've worked out our lessons learned, and now we need to deliver. So it's really important that we set it up right. So in terms of this, at the preliminary stage, the intended outcomes is the sort of core objective of the coordinator. So they are understanding from the client what they want to get out of their scheme. So whether that be energy efficiency improvement works, carbon reduction, improvements to thermal comfort, they may have compliance requirements, so they may have received funding, and that's a particular aspect that they need to achieve. And that really gives you an opportunity to understand what the client wants to get out of the scheme. That is often quite a basic document. It'll list out those intended outcomes and you'll do a tick box and a bit of commentary on those. But again, that is almost a baseline for the property. It should be treated as a baseline. It's what the project is measured against in terms of its success. Some clients may have strategies, and so retrofit strategies, asset management strategies that they have as an existing document that our retrofit project will slip into. So it's important that there is alignment and understanding of those types of documents. Again, that's not in PAS, but it's a really good thing to ask. One thing that I really like to do is complete an initial property assessment and review. So when you get the initial and the expected Excel sheets with rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of property addresses, actually it's such a useful spent time to complete a desktop review. Again, the client may have good asset data, the client may not have good asset data, but even just simply putting yourself down on Google Maps and reviewing those properties can have a massive benefit at a later stage. And to give you an example, I'm working on a project where we are treating an estate of non-traditional properties. So we've got the benefit that they're actually quite similar building types. So all of the same nature of construction. But one of the first things I did, I went around on Google Maps and I looked at the differences in actually the same property type. So had there been extensions built at the back? Were there some odd looking extensions that have been put on the side by the resident over the years? And for that particular project where we were looking at EWI as a primary measure, it really helped weed out those properties that may cause us headaches and issues at an early stage. And that can then really inform the latter stages of the project. So we don't have to wait until our assessor's been out and gathered that information. With the modern world that we're in, a lot of that information can be ascertained. Another idea is the concept of archetyping. So if you don't have the luxury of a estate with all of the same property types, the idea that dwellings can almost be categorized in their similarities. So it's almost an idea that there's no sort of standardized approach to it. And the approach will differ between project to project. But you may look at an archetyping approach, looking at sort of the key construction, the ages, what measures would be suitable. And almost from that criteria that you can list out, you can then work out, okay, these properties are of a similar nature. They're likely to have similar nature in terms of measures. And then again, that will create efficiencies in delivery because you've almost undertaken a holistic approach rather than a individual property approach. Another example is a project execution plan. So again, this is often something that is utilized by a project manager as a method of executing, monitoring and controlling a project. So looking at what the responsibility matrices are, the approach to risk, how the installer will be procured, communication protocols, even things like just when meeting arrangements, who's going to meet when, all of those sorts of things. If you get it right at the beginning, it will make your life so much easier. And there's something that's ingrained in my brain from our managing partner. He always used to say, 10 minutes pre-contract saves you 1 hour post-contract. And the idea is that spending the time up front will make your life much, much easier. So again, use the time that you've got at the start of a project to set it up right. We're now coming on to the dwelling assessment stage. So again, in terms of PAS, this is almost handed to the retrofit assessor and they gather information about the property. So its occupancy, its condition, what the ventilation measures are, the energy performance, so how that building is performing, how the components of the building are performing, and identifies constraints. And again, that is undertaken by the assessor, but in my view, it's really important for the coordinator to have a detailed understanding of the role of the retrofit assessor. And in terms of sort of course duration, if you've completed the retrofit coordinator course, the assessor course is much shorter and definitely worth investing in. So you have a really detailed understanding of simple things like RDSAP conventions. What is really important at this stage in terms of sort of best practice is fully understanding the constraints that are associated with that property. And I've got an example photograph on the screen that you can see. This is a solid wall property, and let's, for argument's sake, say that we're going to treat this property with external wall insulation. So, for example, we've got a core board detail, so when you start thinking about the detailing with the external wall insulation and the roof line, we've got a cast concrete canopy that could be a thermal bridging issue. We've got some brick features between our property and the neighbouring property, and all of this information needs to be captured at the assessment stage. And that's really important. What you can also do is, in terms of best practice, is again think holistically about the project. So I'm currently working on a project with a client who has received SHF Wave 3 funding, and their approach to that project is very much a service-led delivery. So looking at things like solar panels and air source heat pumps. They've got alongside, in terms of, their planned program of work, they've got fabric measures being implemented. So in theory, a lot of these properties should be ready to have those measures received. And what we've decided is, as part of that assessment process, our assessors will gather additional information to really complement the design, the next steps of the process, given those measures. So they are going to be looking at things like where can we site a hot water cylinder, how big is a cupboard, which isn't a requirement of a retrofit assessor, but in terms of delivering this project in an efficient manner, that information is gold dust. And we're creating less disruption for the resident because we're doing that one inspection to begin with. So it's simple things like that that can really benefit the project. Following on from that detailed dwelling assessment, we then again look at a very critical stage of the project, and that's completing the improvement option evaluation and medium-term plan. And that is simulating improvements that can be made. So again, take that property, we can simulate external wall insulation, we can calculate how long it will take to pay back that investment through the savings in energy. Lots of things like that that we can do to then come up with an appropriate package of works for the property. And again, as I said earlier, that shouldn't just be a thought about the now, it should be a thought about the future. We aren't doing deep retrofits to every single property and having them done in one go, because that just wouldn't work. So there needs to be thought given to the later stages. So what measures are we going to install at a later stage? And that's the idea of the medium-term plan. As the coordinator, it's really important that you're cognizant about the limitations on RDSAP and thinking ahead to the design stage. So that property that we were just looking at, if we're looking at RDSAP, it doesn't register whether there are constraints that would affect the installation of external wall insulation. But we need to be thinking about that, because that may affect the measures that we select and are appropriate. So getting it right at this stage is really important for the design stage. So again, we hand over to the retrofit designer at this stage. One thing I always do is just make sure that they do actually have the right qualifications. There are quite strict requirements in terms of those qualifications that they need to hold. Another really useful document when you're reviewing designs is the Measure Interaction Matrix, which is D1 of the PAS standard. And that lists out all measures on the X and Y axis of this table, and then defines what design documentation needs to be produced. So for example, if we were installing loft insulation and external wall insulation, again, two nice visual measures, we need to be thinking about how those two measures interact and what is the detailing going to be between those two measures. I think it's also important, as well as relying on that document, to think about the property and the information again gathered at the dwelling assessment stage, because the measures will interact with the property and the neighbouring property and extensions and features that all needs to be considered in the design stage. If you get the design right and it's a robust design, again, it will massively influence the next stage. And I always try and think about, when I'm reviewing designs, if I was the installer and I was going to lug my EWI to this property tomorrow, would would this design be sufficient for me to install this properly? And I think if you go with that mindset, it will really help. If you don't do that, it then just leads down a pathway of risk of properties remaining open for a longer period of time, scaffolding being left up, residents becoming agitated because we're now rocked up and, oh, what do we do with that detail? Back to the drawing board type approach. Another key thing to consider is building regulations, compliance and warranty requirements. So on the screen here is a property that we're about to start actually. And again, external wall insulation is the primary measure. I've picked EWI based projects because they're nice and visual, but we've got an extension with a sort of perspex type roof, a canopy area. We really need to be thinking about how we would detail our external wall insulation to remain compliant, particularly against the warranty requirements, because the last thing we want to do is arrive on site, install something incorrectly, the warranty doesn't stand up, and there's issues. And that can be said again for the property on the next slide, which again, similar idea. We're treating this with external wall insulation. You can see our retrofit designer curiously measuring that internal area and working out whether we can treat, well, how we're going to treat that area to manage thermal bridging risks. We've also, just slightly off the screen, can clearly see that there's an attached garage which actually attaches to the neighbouring property, has an asbestos roof, is a real constraint and challenge associated with EWI to that elevation. So how are we going to install EWI to that area? Do we need to think about party wall constraints? All of those sorts of things need to be thought about in the design. Because again, if we have a poor design, things often get made up on site, and that's when things go wrong. So again, this then leads to the installation stage. So as we said before, the earlier stages really positively impact this part. And there's a lot more for the RC to do now under the sort of letter of the law of PAS. So they need to be attending sites. They need to oversee the installation. They need to see measures being installed during and post completion. And that needs to be digitally evidenced, and that actually forms part of the lodgement now under PAS. So you need to do that as a retrofit coordinator. But what are some of the things that you can do to supplement and make sure that that process works as efficiently and really, just works well, is by looking at tools. So digital tools. We use something called FieldView, which is like a cloud-based quality assurance type platform where you load a floor plan of a property onto the tablet, and then you from that can drop pins onto the tablet and the plan to document things. So it could be progress, it could be requests for information, it could be issues, and all of that can then be easily issued to the installer. And again, just follows the idea of a sort of a golden thread approach. Other things you can do, simple things like when you're starting the first property in the project, agree with the installer hold points. So again, using EWI because it's nice and visual. We're going to install all of the EWI boards and the mechanical fixing. And before you crack on with any render or brick slips, myself as a retrofit coordinator is going to attend site and make sure that I'm satisfied that the spacing and fixing details have been met. There's not large gaps between the EWI boards. And often if you follow that approach of the first time you do something, you go over it with a fine-tooth comb, it'll then inform the next properties that follow on, and it'll almost become business as usual with that quality idea. Again, things like training and toolbox talks, really opening that dialogue with the installer, having that two-way dialogue. I've stood on scaffolding with a roofer and we've talked through details, and it's so beneficial for both parties. So yeah, make sure you're really delving into those properties and really understanding them and viewing them. Last but not least is completion and lodgement. We do actually have a session next week covering sort of the post RC role, which will go into a lot of detail in terms of completion and lodgement. I think Matt's doing that, so I won't steal his thunder. But it is a pivotal point. So all of that documentation that's been produced throughout the PAS process gets gathered and amalgamated and submitted to Trustmark. We take handover of all of those measures that have been installed, really make sure that they're all functioning, etc., etc. In terms of sort of like best practice around that, again, agreeing the protocols that will sort of form the processes that sit behind it. So what's the handover process? For a PV and air source heat pump, are we ensuring that the installer gives a good demonstration to the occupant, and also maybe their asset management team? They may have been used to repairing gas boilers for the last 30 years, and actually now they're going to be maintaining air source heat pumps. So again, thinking about that holistic approach and the future of that property. For larger schemes, we also do lessons learned workshops, and they can even be implemented during a project, particularly if you've got a large scale project. If you can weed out the things that are going wrong and have a sort of continual improvement type approach, it will only make the project become a success, and you can, again, quickly steer the ship back on track. Again, there's often residents that really engage with retrofit, and capturing their feedback can be so beneficial, again, for future work, and really powerful. It's, you know, all well and good me talking about retrofit, but if you can get a resident talking about the benefits, it is so beneficial. And finally, almost the idea of a soft landings approach, which is a term that almost means that when those measures are implemented, there's a soft landing for it. So the people who are living in, maintaining, all understand how that building has changed, because what we're doing is fundamentally changing how these buildings operate. So we need to make sure that everyone's ready for that. That leaves me sort of the final remarks. So again, my sort of top tip would be, as the RC, you need to be very present. You need to be a key role in the project and really understand how you fit into the wider project structure. So, you know, if you're executing your role very well and also supplementing these other roles, it's always going to be of benefit. And again, starting to think with these projects at scale now, treating these projects as a construction project so we can keep them on track, keep them on time for delivery, and make them a success. I think that takes me to the end.